Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. So in my last installment of the Petscop Investigation, part 6 that is, I mentioned that I was considering doing a comment response video on this series. So here we are. I actually found this to be somewhat of a, cathartic process. Going through all the comments and responding to a select few. It's kind of a grind, At various points in the process of making these videos, there are various ebbs and flows, as it were, in my enthusiasm and general energy level. I usually start having a mild existential crisis during the writing and early editing phase. I think, why am I doing this? I have nothing new to say. But then I get a second wind towards the later portion of the editing process when things start coming together. There are various stages. I assume if you're a writer or involved in pretty much any creative endeavor, you probably understand what I'm talking about. The point being, I really try to produce a meaningful discussion about the subject matter in my videos, and I think it is abundantly true in the case of my Petscop Investigation series. I have been overwhelmed by the number of insightful comments I've received since I put out my very first video on the topic. A few of these I've actually dug up from prior installments, so these are not all from part 6, and unfortunately I don't have time to respond to every comment, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to highlight a few that I thought were especially noteworthy. Here's a good question from part 1 of the first installment of the investigation series. Question for you. So it's become clear that the game only looks unfinished as the real quote-unquote game is hidden. What do you think was the reason then for it being made to look like it's an unfinished game? Why go through all the trouble of making it look like the game was never finished when it could have just as easily been made to look finished but small or anything really? So there must have been a reason for this. This is a good question. So there are a number of different ways to approach this. We can try and look at it from the perspective of the character who designed the game in the fictional universe of Petscop, presumably this person called Rainer. I think at this point it is fair to say this game was designed for someone specifically, or perhaps a specific set of people. Recall the note that accompanied the game that said, "For you." Now, I would speculate that making the game look unfinished is perhaps a means to deter anyone who isn't in the know from playing it. That is, if you don't have the code to access the new Maker plane, you're only going to be able to catch a few pets and not much else. So you're going to lose interest and stop playing at some point. This is perhaps a way to prevent random people from accessing sensitive information in the game. Of course, we can also look at it from a thematic perspective. Essentially, there's a kind of duality at play between surface and subsurface exhibited throughout the series. In part 6 of my investigation, I noted that if you were to base your understanding of Petscop, the game, solely on the cheery artifice of even care, you would have a very skewed idea of what Petscop actually is. You'd think it's nothing more than an unfinished children's game, rather than an enigmatic series of logical challenges, the contents of which allude to some horrible events. This, I think, speaks to the pain and suffering that occurs beneath the surface of what appears to be a healthy, functioning system. This user brought up a possible literary allusion in response to one of my Petscop Discovery Phase live streams. Tell me if this is way off base, but I think the windmill is an allusion to Don Quixote. I know the chat mentioned it, but thematically, that's very interesting to me. Breaking it down bare bones, tilting at windmills is a metaphor for swiping at ghosts, or basically like delusion, trying to defeat something that isn't what you think it is and cannot be defeated. I think thematically, the utter uselessness of it seems to have something to do with the mistreatment of children, like the outrage one feels about the foster care system while upholding the power structures that make a system like that possible. I think that is an astute observation. Thanks for the comment. So here's another very thoughtful comment I received on part 2 of my investigation series. This user recommended a series of Reuters articles that I will link to in the video description. The subject of these articles is an investigation that exposed a number of incidences in which children were adopted from overseas and later quote-unquote rehomed through dubious means with a total lack of oversight by the state, sometimes leading to abuse and neglect. I think you'll find that there are some very conspicuous and disturbing parallels to some of the themes in Petscop. Here's a question pertaining to the strange situation procedure mentioned in Part 6 of the investigation series. Recall that Petscop makes an explicit reference to this in the 14th video when Paul's save file is erased. And as you might recall, the new file is labeled Strange Situation. This user asks, is it possible that the quote-unquote secure and quote-unquote insecure children of this strange situation procedure correspond to A and NLM? So I think there is a strong correlation between these so-called attachment styles spelled out in the strange situation criteria and these enigmatic types that appear in Petscop. That is A, B, and NLM. But I'm not sure if it's a precise one-to-one parallel. I should note that the literature suggests there is some variance in how the so-called insecure attachment style presents itself in children. In other words, there are multiple subtypes, and this might explain the 3 types that continually appear in Petscop. So A could mean secure in this context, and B, along with NLM, could be different subtypes of the insecure attachment style. And in fact, there is another type hypothesized called disorganized or disoriented, which I think may very well correspond to the NLM type presented in Petscop. But I'm not a psychologist, and I don't really feel equipped to fully explain all of these attachment styles to you, so I'll leave it at that. If someone wants to do some digging, I do think further research is merited on this whole strange situation parallel. And here's a good observation. One user commented, I'm surprised you didn't mention how the quote-unquote come here written under do you remember being born looks like it was written with a texture editor as well as the messages from the pink tool. I have nothing to add to that other than, I think you're right that both of these previous messages could very well have been written using the texture map editor function in the game. So kudos for calling attention to that. Another thing to clarify here, nothing to see here, move along says, just a note, we do have confirmation that Paul's birthday is November 12th. In Petscop 11, Paul mentions that he and Care are exactly the same age. The word exactly implies that it is more specific than simply being the same number of years old, meaning that they were born on the exact same day. Thanks for pointing that out. Here's a comment from the LAG radio network. Still convinced that Petscop 16 is old VHS footage, possibly surveillance of Belle or even Marvin being monitored while playing the game. It has that fuzzy artifact look of a VHS recording. I'm old enough to know what that looks like, and I just haven't been able to convince myself otherwise since that video dropped. That's definitely worth taking into consideration. I think it's really anyone's guess who or what exactly the 16th video pertains to. Anyway, the LAG radio network is doing an investigation of their own, so check it out. I'll have a link to their SoundCloud in the video description. Another user pointed out that there's a moment in the 14th video when Paul, who is presumably a stand-in for Care at this point, is asked a very ominous question. Why are you covering your face? Recall the diagram from the second video in which Care NLM is depicted covering her face. This user further speculates that the party was for Care A, but she was already, in fact, Care NLM. This is a great observation, and I think there's other evidence to support it as well. Consider the sign outside which depicts Care in her initial state, Care A. This would seem to support the notion that the party is, in fact, for Care A. Here's a comment from my latest video, and it's one that I think offers a pretty interesting view of nostalgia. I realize it has become a progressive cause to vilify nostalgia, but nostalgia is a very human emotion that shouldn't be easily dismissed. And then they link to an essay from In These Times. Petscop is in many ways a subversion of our nostalgia for 90s video games, but that doesn't change the fact that it's our nostalgia that makes the meta horror of Petscop so effective. So, thanks for sharing your thoughts. I understand how my comments about nostalgia in Part 6 might be perceived like I'm sort of railing against this tendency to romanticize the past. I certainly don't want to give the impression that I think nostalgia is, like, immoral or something like that. It's more so that I think nostalgia is something that emerges and becomes ubiquitous in culture when future possibilities have been seemingly exhausted. In my last video, I include a link to a lecture by the late Mark Fisher, so watch that if you're interested in exploring this line of thought. But anyway, this user brings up a good point, and while I have not read the short story they cited, I think I understand the basic gist of the quote. I'll include a link to the essay referenced here. It's a pretty good read, so check it out. So, I have at various points said that I believe Petscop is, in some ways, subverting the creepypasta genre. Here's an alternative perspective that I think holds water. One thing I really love about Petscop is that it's able to dive right into genre conventions without getting hung up by them. A mysterious game no one's heard of, a short unfinished level with a dark secret, a skeptical narrator slowly being drawn in, a mysterious connection or a supernatural quality to the game. They're all practically cliches at this point, but Petscop is confident enough to embrace them all without ever losing its stride. The video says that the series subverts the creepypasta genre, but in a way I think it works also as a pure expression of it. It plays a lot of the core features of the genre completely straight, but executes it masterfully, just while sustaining a slow burn of mystery and suspense instead of falling victim to the trap of giving away its surprises too quickly, like a lot of spooky video game stories tend to do. That's a good point. This comment is from a user called Yellow Gin, and it's in response to part 6, my latest video. I'm going to be straight with you. I heavily disagree with your thoughts within the last few minutes. It never occurred to me beyond the symptom of child abuse that this had anything to do with late capitalism, and it personally disappoints me that this series decided to go in this route. I don't really know what to say. I don't know if that's what you took away from it, and you're not labeling the entire thing as a sort of art piece about the futility of capitalism, but I know that I never thought about the economy or anything like that. It's your video, you can say whatever you want and come to your own conclusions, but now I feel like for whatever new videos are made or any videos you have made have the undertones of political activism, and makes me question what you're saying as biased. Of course, everyone has bias and I'm aware of that, but in my personal opinion, this is not the place to have it. If I were making a video like this, which I am not, but I feel that I don't need any sort of political views anywhere where I don't think that they belong. I just wanted a theory video about some cryptic and well-made web series about a guy who is possibly captured by some higher power, not reality. I don't want reality, I don't want political commentary unless I came for it. It's what I'm trying to get away from. So here's my response. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I'm sorry the video went in a direction you weren't happy with, but here's the thing. What you're essentially expecting me to do here is not discuss any real-world issues in relation to a work of art. I believe this is antithetical to how art functions in society. I don't think you can have a meaningful conversation about art without talking about its socio-political context. The onus is not on me to steer clear of topics that you deem out of bounds for whatever reason. So, to those of you who view Petscop and the other works I cover as a means to escape the drudgery of your lives or perhaps the endless cycle of depressing world events, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be catering to this perspective. So maybe keep that in mind, and if you're not in the mood for a Nightmare Masterclass video, you can watch something else. It's okay. You won't hurt my feelings. We all need to escape from time to time, but that's not what my channel is about. As I've stated numerous times in the past, I'm not saying my interpretation of Petscop is the only way to look at it. I'm not trying to dictate to you what the work means in an authoritative sense. That's never been my goal. In a broad sense, my objective with the Petscop investigation, and indeed every work I cover, has been to foster critical thinking in my viewership and produce meaningful conversations. And I hope I'm accomplishing that, at least to some degree. On a related note, there were a fair amount of other people who didn't appreciate the direction my latest video took, namely the political issues I brought up in relation to Petscop. So I'm going to take this opportunity to respond to the critics. I'm just going to preface this by saying that I generally do appreciate feedback on my videos, but if I'm being completely honest, I don't have much use for comments like these. It's one thing if you're just not seeing certain connections I make in my videos, and maybe I could do a better job of making my points more coherently. There's always room for improvement. but I get the sense that a lot of people aren't even listening. And I don't think this sort of knee-jerk, low-effort kind of cynicism is productive. I would even go so far as to say it's part of a larger trend known as anti-intellectualism. Of course, I'm a humble Midwestern boy, and I would rather throw myself into a ditch filled with raw sewage than allow myself to be called an intellectual. Yuck. I do, however, consider myself to be engaging in an intellectual exercise when I analyze a work. And that necessarily entails making connections to real-world stuff, such as, politics or the economy, just for instance. This is just part of the process for me. And if you want more context for how I approach critical analysis, check out my Theorist Handbook series. Idea Channel also has a good video that touches on this issue called A Defense of Overthinking Pop Culture. I'll have a link to that in the video description. So, here's my perspective. I made an hour-long video presenting evidence in the work that I believe supports my view. If you have an alternative view of what Petscop is about, that's cool. Offer something in that regard. Tell me what you think it's about. Or at the very least, engage with one single point I made in the video. Just one. Look, I get it. It's a YouTube comment. I'm certainly not expecting a dissertation. But there's a certain trend in which I receive comments, sometimes very long, wordy comments, ironically enough, that basically amount to little more than, "No, I think you're wrong," without any counter-argument or presentation of an alternative view. And it's like, what am I supposed to do with that? It's a conversation stopper. Why not continue the conversation? I don't expect anyone to agree with me about the particulars, but I will be challenging my viewers to engage with the ideas I present. The general charge brought against me here is that I'm injecting my own political views into the conversation, despite it not being relevant to the work. I would say this is an attitude rooted in our shared notion of what it means to be explicitly, quote-unquote, political. It is often met with cynicism when one crosses that arbitrary line into the realm of politics. I think this is a uniquely American thing, and it's generally not conducive to a meaningful conversation about the subject matter. And I really don't think that politics is something that you can inject into a conversation that is otherwise apolitical. I should also note that generally, the only time people seem to express this flat-out refusal to, even entertain the idea that politics is relevant is when they either disagree with the perceived content of what I'm saying, or they just don't even want to go there for whatever reason. When they agree, it's just common sense that what I'm saying is well established in the work. This is ideology at play. What is taken for granted as common sense, and what seems to be wildly off base, hinge entirely on one's ideological framework. The point being, ideological assumptions are rarely questioned without provocation. Calling attention to how ideology functions can be uncomfortable because it jars people out of their default state and demystifies certain aspects of culture. Ideology operates best when it's unseen, i.e., when it's the normative perspective. You should be a little suspicious of those who present themselves as being somehow apolitical. And hey, at least with me, you know what you're getting. A cranky socialist who has too much time on his hands. I've said this before, but it's worth reiterating. The idea that we can separate politics from everything else in life is a bad way to frame things, because politics is, at its core, a matter of power dynamics in society. And horror is probably the most political genre because what people fear often has deep-seated ideological implications. On that note, here is another user accusing me of using the work as a quote-unquote springboard to, advance my own political views, I guess. So this user says, I'm usually with you on the whole using the excuse of video essay or analysis to criticize society as a whole, i.e. your Harvey video, but I really do feel like the conclusions you draw at the end of this one seem more like personal thoughts you had provoked by the government shutdown with little to no correlation to Petscop. In fact, the way you presented this came off like using someone else's hard work as a springboard for your own opinions about culture as a whole, tacked on at the end of an unrelated video. So, thanks for the comment, but I have to say I disagree with this characterization of what I do. It seems a bit cynical to me. I don't use the video essay format as an excuse to criticize society. I don't need an excuse to discuss real-world problems. I don't know where that's coming from. But, aside from that, I made the point in my last video that government shutdowns are a symptom of a larger problem, namely our unstable system. So that is the context in which I referenced the government shutdown. It's not an aside, it's contextualized within the larger interpretation that I've gradually formulated over the course of the investigation series. The point I'm making is that we have a system built on coercive dynamics that creates bad incentives and leads to needless suffering and even dehumanization. I do think the framework of Petscop, the game, artfully mimics this system. So that's where I'm coming from. Again, it's okay if you disagree or just aren't convinced by my general arguments, but I would appreciate just a bit more engagement with the actual substance of what I say, instead of this, offhanded dismissal. Here's a comment about technology. I think there is an inescapable trend in every source of intellect we consume. That is, we are set up for a collapse, the biggest societal collapse in human history, no less. However, I disagree that it has to do with ideology. I think that late capitalism is rather a symptom than the cause of the dissolution of human connection between individuals. Simply put, our technology and knowledge shaped our culture in a way that made it possible to enjoy life without bearing other people, like we're supposed to. And as a consequence, our relationships are disintegrating at an ever-accelerating pace. And we're looking at each other less as fellow humans and more as inconveniences to one another. Thanks for the comment. So this is sort of a chicken and egg scenario. Technology and our economy are interconnected, and the causes and effects of these things are not so easily untangled. But I would argue that it begins with the mode of production, and that's an economic issue. And I've stated a few times on this channel that I believe technology is always a reflection of societal values, not vice versa. But it's an interesting comment nonetheless. Here is a lengthy comment that touches on a number of issues brought up in my last investigation video. I thought the point about austerity was a rather good and interesting one. In America, it is mostly the states that impose such budget cutbacks, which only tend to hurt the most vulnerable. On the other hand, I'm not sure if there's any indication that the characters in the story are on the quote-unquote margins of society from any economic point of view. In fact, the setting tends to focus on a fairly normal middle-class household that would be able to afford PlayStations and pianos and garages. Precisely the kind of family that would have found the 90s to be a great time, especially if they're white, which is largely the implication through depictions of care. There's also no evidence to suggest the depicted abuse and or neglect is a result of economic hardship. Just the opposite, really. Marvin is painted as having largely malevolent and sadistic motivations. As a result, I'm not really sure if the allusion to Bill Clinton and economic inequality in the 90s ever really lands in the late part of the video. Clinton can be linked to having hostility towards welfare, but not austerity in a broad sense. He raised taxes on the rich specifically to pay for more social programs and proposed healthcare reform that was more robust than anything Obama proposed. Thank you for the comment. Here's my response. I would say the thing Clinton really accomplished and should be remembered for is his ability to manage the expectations of his Democratic base, as the general political orientation of our country shifted further and further to the right. For instance, it's true that Clinton raised taxes on the rich to a minute degree, but this was after Reagan lowered them to insane proportions. And notably, the tax on capital gains was actually lowered under Clinton. So the fact that you cite his raising taxes on the rich a few percentages as evidence that he was anti-austerity kind of illustrates my point about his ability to manage expectations. This, combined with the god-awful welfare reform bill that Clinton signed into law, leads me to be fairly critical of his administration. Let's move on to this idea that the setting in Petscop is middle class, and therefore there is no indication that the series focuses on those in the margins. For starters, just because a family has a PlayStation or a piano, that doesn't mean they're not about to have their house foreclosed on, which is what happened to so many families during the 2008 economic collapse. And it certainly doesn't mean they're not about to go into bankruptcy due to medical debt. I should note there is a forlorn nature in which the house in Petscop is referred to as something of a nostalgic totem, an item of remembrance that is no longer an active presence in the speaker's life. One thing I also want to elaborate on is that there are different forms of marginalization that don't directly boil down to the sheer economics of the situation, at least not in terms that can be easily unpacked. For instance, consider the moment in the 11th video when the player is implored to stay at the house. Paul reads a note that says, "My husband may come here after 6, please stay if you can." So this woman has resorted to asking an individual, not the police, not the state, to protect her child. Note also the force field around care in the same video. I have previously speculated that this symbolized an order of protection. Of course, this force field is very quickly destroyed when Marvin breaks into the house through the window. This is because no one is there to enforce the order of protection. Again, it's merely symbolic. There's a sense in which the system has failed to really protect this woman and her child. We can only speculate about the reasons for this, but there are of course many real-world instances in which police have either not taken the claims of domestic abuse victims seriously, or the victims have been reluctant to report the abuse out of fear of that occurring. The point being, merely because there appears to be a base level of comfort present in terms of the economic conditions, that does not in turn mean that a process of marginalization or structural violence is not taking place. And of course, how a given system serves to perpetuate or reinforce this activity is worth a larger conversation. I've also previously said that if you consider children as a group, they are undoubtedly the most marginalized people in society. I focus on this in part 4 of my analysis. Children disproportionately suffer the absolute worst of life's various miseries, and data generally shows that to be the case. Watch my previous videos for more context and check out the sources provided in the video descriptions. Now, to be sure, this is something of a truism. Perhaps it's more of an existential point rather than an explicitly political one. It's kind of a given that children have little to no agency in their situation just due to reality. But Petscop continually alludes to structural or institutional forms of violence, specifically with reference to children. There's a lot of evidence for this in the work. For instance, if you consider the quote-unquote pets in the game who are at various points subject to a hidden form of dehumanization, I think you'd be hard-pressed not to acknowledge that marginalization is something of a theme. Also recall the so-called quote-unquote child library system. Of course, this is all implicit and no work of art is going to spell it out for you in obvious terms. But the point here is that individuals in the work are categorized through a certain typology that leads to them being marginalized in various ways. Here's another comment from my latest Petscop analysis, that is, the 6th video. This user asks, is there evidence of the growing prevalence of issues often attributed to quote-unquote late capitalism? Is there a statistical analysis that shows these issues are happening at a larger scale than in previous decades in capitalist societies? As of now, I'm skeptical of the term's validity, but I'm open to changing my view if presented with good enough evidence. So this is likely a response to a line towards the end of the video where I say that the form of institutional violence depicted in Petscop is sadly common in the epoch known as late capitalism. You'll notice that my claim here is far more limited in scope than what this user is asking me to provide evidence for. Or, maybe they're just asking an open question. I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I'm just pointing out that this is an extremely broad question that can be taken in a number of directions. Let me expound on just one point I touched on in part 6 of the investigation series. In the description for that video, I supply a link to a source, which I will include in the description description for this video as well. It states that extreme poverty in the United States, that is, people who survive on less than $2 a day, has roughly doubled since welfare reform in the 90s, which I would argue was essentially a neoliberal reform. There are almost 1 million more families living on less than $2 per day per person in the US, and 3 million children live in these households. This is occurring in the richest country on the planet. So this is just one example in which the period known as late capitalism is one in which the most vulnerable among us are increasingly made to suffer. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that this is a systemic problem. Here's a comment from the 5th video of my investigation series. I think the proprietor of Petscop has contracted Nightmare Masterclass to create this in-depth analyzation of the game. I realized this when the narrator said he deduced the game was referring to transhumanism because of the fact that the color of the cars in the tunnel, which referred to zeros and ones in his opinion, formed a particular sequence of zeros and ones. He then expects us to believe that this binary code, which isn't even comprised of enough bits to form a single byte, was somehow linked to a transhumanism article on the internet. Nope, that's more than a stretch. That's blatantly fabricated bullshit. Hence, Nightmare Masterclass has some sort of personal motivation to portray Petscop in a particular way. My guess is the creator of Petscop has some very specific messages he or she wants to get across, and through the use of Nightmare Masterclass, they can ensure that the messages remain unambiguous and clear in certain thematic ways, while retaining the mysterious nature of the game and other themes because of Nightmare Masterclass's assumed objective perception of the game, in my opinion. So I'm not sure if this guy is trolling or not, but I should point out that the transhumanism reference I made in part 5 was a connection initially made in the so-called comprehensive progress document. I just read an article they linked to and thought it was interesting. So Carlos, if you consider that reference to be blatantly fabricated bullshit, you should know that it wasn't fabricated by me personally. I just used it as a jumping off point to discuss some of the broader themes of the series. I do think there's a link between the topic of transhumanism and Paul thinking there's some kind of entity in the game. And I think it should go without saying, but I am not being paid off by the creator of Petscop. I would probably have a nicer car if that were the case. But you know, I'm kind of questioning your motives, user. I mean, how do we know you're not being paid off as a part of an elaborate plan to call my various theories into question? Well, that's the last comment. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Please know that any amount, large or small, would be highly appreciated. And thank you to everyone who donated in the last couple of weeks. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the following people: Relvitica, Matt, Joshua A., Serious Delirium, Wolf, Tyler K., Altruistic Artistry, Mark W., Alexa, Ruesikin, sorry if I mispronounced that, Michelle R., and Allison. Thank you for watching, and good night.